Good morning, good morning, good morning, everyone. Hope everyone's having a good week. Um, it's hump day. Uh, Thank you for being here today. We're really excited that you're joining us for this very important discussion. Um, as many of you know, as part of our Discover Boating's work with the Market Expansion Advisory Group, the group commissioned, global research firm Ipsos, who you're going to hear from in a short period here, to gain strategic insights on the evolving dynamics of recreational boating. And this collaboration was aimed to help Discover Boating, which everyone knows powered by NMMA and MRAA, understand the landscape today, trends that are shaping recreational boating, and actions that we need to take to retain and grow the category. There are a couple objectives that Ipsos focus on with the qualitative interviews with there were qualitative interviews with industry leaders and qualitative research with current and potential boaters. And so there was a variety of groups that the research included. What was uncovered, there were three areas that was uncovered. We wanted to uncover the macro forces affecting today's consumer that will impact the boating category in broad operating context. Highlight how the boat owner has changed, focusing on how they access boating, which is very important, how they learn about it, who and what influences them in terms of making purchases, and who tomorrow's boat owners will be. That's very important. Explore and identify predictive factors that indicate likelihood to own a recreational boat so we can grow the category. All of these are very important, and the research that was conducted was designed to address a lot of these questions. There's going to be an opportunity for Q&A at the end of this, but before I speak any longer, I want to introduce Stephanie Dawn and Jennifer Bender from Ipsos, who've been working with us over the past year and has conducted a number of webinars across the industry thus far. Stephanie and Jennifer, take it away.
Thank you, Kevin. Okay, everyone. So we're going to take you through really what we were calling an executive summary. We're going to focus on the boating landscape today, particularly with a focus on prospective owners. We will cover how they differ from your current owners to really highlight what it means as an industry for you to better reach and kind of convert these people who are contemplating purchase. And then Jen is going to take you through into some of those macro forces, particularly how they will impact and shape the approach by which you take to reach these consumers. And then, as Kevin mentioned, we'll have some time at the end for Q&A. Okay. As a quick note, Kevin mentioned this, I'll go over it quickly, is what did we do? So from a quantitative perspective, after examining all the macro forces in the industry and doing some qual, we did a quantitative survey, very robust base sizes, about 500 current owners, 500 lapsed owners, and 500 prospective owners. When we talk about prospects, they are self-identifying as being at least 50% or more likely to purchase a motorized powerboat or a sailboat in the future. They have not owned a boat in the past, and they do not currently own one of these types of boats. So the survey was about 20 minutes long, and we ended up clustering our prospects on different measures that really give you unique, discernible, and targetable groups of prospects to target. So we'll share that with you as we go through the information. But the other really exciting thing is that NMMA is putting this research into action already. So we are moving along with making progress. So when we talk about our target boaters, we're going to talk about six groups of interest overall. We have current groups, current owners, and prospective owners. And these groups are very different. They have different needs, different motivations, different barriers that are preventing them from using their boat more often or purchasing a boat. And so they all need specific tactics to really effectively engage them and convert them. By understanding this, we are really able to understand where you can play, how you can win with these consumers, thinking about not only what you've done in the past, but what you need to do in the future to convert this different audience of consumers. This you may have seen before. This was put together with NMMA and the Alex partners, but this is the new funnel. And the primary research for Discover Boating is to really reach and inspire potential boaters. So we'll talk about which what the target is for Discover Boating and what the targets are for dealers and manufacturers. But what we see here is that when it gets to becoming an area where it's time to engage, we have a group of hand raisers. And this is where dealers, clubs, OEMs really can come in and continue the journey for the consumer to actual conversion of ownership. So as I mentioned, we have six groups. So on the left, when we think about our current owners, we're thinking about them in two kind of distinct groups. The first are your established owners. These are people who have purchased a boat prior to 2020. They have a different perspective. They have different experiences with the category and the industry. They maybe have been brought up in the industry since childhood. They're financially different. They're demographically different. And then we have recent buyers who have purchased their boat primarily after 2020, potentially due to the COVID, crisis and the desire to be outside more. But anyone since then and onwards, they do look different from our established owners, and we'll get into how. But think about it as financially, their situations are different. Demographically, their situations are different, and their exposure to the industry looks a little bit different. Then, when we think about prospective owners, we've clustered them into four groups. And as mentioned, we clustered them based on a few key measures around, how likely they are to buy, what their budget is, when they expect to actually make a purchase, and what their barriers are. And what we have is two groups that are really more towards the top of that funnel. They need to be reached and inspired, and these are the primary targets for Discover Boating. One group is very cost conscious. They're not financially ready, but they are open to alternative access models, which is an important kind of characteristic and factor to consider. We also have a group of time pressed consumers. Their core barrier is that they don't see the value of owning a boat because of the amount of time they feel they can dedicate to it to make it feel worthwhile. So for them, they are also open to alternative access models, but they could also be influenced in terms of different ways of encouraging them and showcasing how they can integrate usage of this boat more often so that it feels like a better value. On the right around that engaged aspect of the funnel, we have two groups. The first is an inexperienced group, and this group has the means to buy a boat, but they feel like they need more hands-on experience, more knowledge, more support. They don't feel prepared to own a boat. So that's really where dealers, manufacturers can come in and really encourage and help these consumers feel like they know exactly what they're doing, they know what kind of boat to get, they know all the ins and outs, and they are confident that their purchase is going to really be successful in the long run. And then our sales ready group. This group has the fewest barriers, the highest budget, and they are ready to buy. So they are really a conversion play. When we look at current owners and prospective owners from a high level, our prospective owners tend to be much younger. They do have a lower income. That is largely due to, I think, the state of the economy, potentially also being younger, being less formally educated as well. They are more likely to have been engaging with boats via charters and rentals. So, in comparison to current owners, I think we see a little bit more of a legacy experience with the industry. Family, parents, grandparents, growing up with boats. We don't see that as much, but we know engagement with the category is a huge indicator of the likelihood to purchase. So that's really where it's important to think about if people aren't ready to buy today, how can we still encourage them to interact with the category? How can we still get them on the water? How can we still get them experiences the same way that prior owners experienced it through family and friends? The other big difference between these groups is your prospects have a different purchase funnel and different influences. So the dealer will always be important, the manufacturer, the source of expertise, but prospective owners, and this is even true for your more recent buyers, they are much more inclined to be interested in social media, videos, TikTok, YouTube, all of those sources of information where they can see people engaging in the category. Websites, articles, reviews, those are sort of secondary to your prospects, and they used to be the primary source of information for your current owners. So that's a big difference as well between these two groups. So, taking a closer look at our prospective owners, we have some more detail on each of them, but at a high level, just to give you kind of greater clarity, your cost conscious group are not financially ready. So, this is a group that we really want to focus on. How can we keep them interested in the category at a lower financial kind of threshold? They're less likely to be advanced, so we need to get opportunities to make them feel more prepared. We'll potentially learn about the boat as they're on it, charters, boat clubs, rentals. That's really going to be a great opportunity for this group, as well as education and the ability to just get on the water. The other important thing to remember when we talk about cost consciousness is it is not just sale price. It is maintenance costs, it is insurance, it is gas, it is storage, it is all of the additional things you have to pay for that you may not know about until you buy a boat, especially thinking that these people did not grow up with a parent or a grandparent having seen how they, take care of boats and what they have to spend on. Our time pressed group is probably one of the more challenging groups because we can't give people more time. But what we can do is highlight how the boats can fit into their lives, how they can use it in different ways. What are the emotional benefits, the mental benefits that they will get from being on the water? And also, what are the convenient places that they can use their vessel? Most of these people live in the South, so near the ocean, but also near a lot of other waterways. And so, how can we encourage potentially greater use or more versatile use of a boat? Your inexperienced group, they have the means, but this is the group that really needs to feel more prepared personally. What we see among prospects and, consumers today is that they want all the information. They want to feel prepared. They don't want any unplanned surprises down the line. So this group really wants to understand the best boat for them, for their use, best ways to maneuver it, all the information that will really encourage them and take them from a beginner to a more intermediate or advanced boater. And then your sales ready group, they are really ready for a sales discussion. Something to keep in mind with this group is they are significantly more likely to have kids in the home. And so talking about owning a boat as a good avenue for families, as, what it could teach your kids, it's all going to resonate really strongly for this group because it is expected to be a family, you know, activity. We have a few slides. I'll run through these a little quickly, but you can all access them. At the end, we'll share a QR code where you can get lots more information on each of these groups. But what you'll see on each of these slides are key demographics, the amount of discretionary income they have. So not only thinking about their household income, but how much of that actually goes to necessities. So with this cost-conscious group, you see that majority have less than 10% discretionary income. So it's really not a financial time for them to make that significant of a purchase. They are aware of Discover Boating, but that can definitely be increased. So really reaching them and marketing towards them and encouraging them to even participate from an adjacent outside perspective in the category will help. The primary barriers are on the right, and you can see for this group, it is largely around all things that impact the cost. On the next slide, you'll see the same kind of information for our time pressed group. Interestingly, this group skews more male. It's not as female as the other groups. It does also skew millennial and Gen X. They tend to also have slightly more discretionary income. I would say about 25%, 10 to 25% for this group. So they have a little bit more money to spend, but again, for them, it's really assessing, will I have enough time to use this regularly to feel like it is worth the investment? In terms of purchase time frame and budget, it's all relatively average when we look at the total group of prospective buyers. Our inexperienced group, again, they're ready. They're potentially financially ready, but they don't feel ready. Tends to skew a little bit younger, but also a little bit older. So we have a skew of Gen X, I mean, a skew of Gen Z and a skew of boomers. And I think this makes sense because these are probably the times in your life where you tend to have some slightly higher discretionary income. You're maybe not taking care of a family or paying for all of the things that come with kids. We also see this group to be the most diverse ethnically. So we have more Black consumers, more Hispanic consumers. They do tend to be more likely to live in the Northeast, but still very high representation in the South as well. And you can see on the right here for them, it's what's the boat that's right for me? How do I operate a boat the best way? This could also include how do I read the tides or how and why is the wind important? And, all of those things that help you feel prepared for even unforeseen things happening on the water. And then our last group is, like I said, the most ready for a purchase. You can see on the left here that 68% have kids in the household, and this is about double what we see from a Gen Pop census perspective. So very heavily children in the household, very heavily millennial, and they have higher discretionary income as well. So here about 50 to 75% is of discretionary income represents half of these consumers, which is very high. They also have the highest budget. So this group, again, fewer barriers. The main one is really some information about costing. They definitely still want that transparency. They still want to know all of the things that they could end up paying for beyond the sale price, but they're definitely the lowest hanging fruit for conversion. As I mentioned in the handbook, you will have a lot more information around how they're making purchases, how important the water gene is to them. So, how important are previous experiences and the perception of benefits that you get from being on the water, and then some information around how you can target them and speak to them relevantly via different life milestones, the social media they use, and just general attitudes, values, etc.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Stephanie. And on that note about how much is in the handbooks, I think this is a continuation of that in the sense that we have a lot of rich information, as Stephanie mentioned, not just about who these prospective owners are today, but how things are going to evolve. And so three of the things that really came to the surface in our analysis that are influencing, I would say not just current voters, but also current prospects, and a lot of this should feel familiar to you, but what we'll go through is connecting some of the things that we're seeing in the news headlines today and things that we're grappling with, in our own lives, and how that's going to potentially affect consumer behavior and how that's going to affect the mindset with which people come into the category. So, three things that we want to really touch on today are one, economic uncertainties. Two is around social reconfiguration, what that looks like today and tomorrow. And then third is around tech acceleration. So we have a snapshot of each of these, and there's much more detail in the handbooks for you to go through on your own. But this first one is really important, and I think Stephanie touched on it a little bit, talking about not just how much discretionary income different groups have, but also about some of those barriers and some of those worries. And we certainly see that this is coming through in terms of lower consumer confidence, by the way, overall, not just according to the boating industry. But at the same time, we're also seeing people focus more on experiences. And I think that's a really bright spot for us as an industry to think about, because despite inflation, despite, lower economic confidence, people are still spending and they are still prioritizing experiences. So this, I think, is certainly something for us to think about. They're just being more choiceful about where they're spending and what they're focusing their efforts on. And so if we think about, what does this mean for our target voter groups that Stephanie was just going through? Number one, that increased cost of living that we've seen, not just from the inflationary environment, but with the slower wage growth, that really is going to continue, unfortunately for the near term. So I don't think that's going to necessarily change. And what we're seeing reflected is that new boat sales are indeed softening as people are becoming more selective about, when they're purchasing, how much they're spending. And so, what we expect to happen is that boat buyers will prioritize value and utility. They'll look to really maximize every dollar they spend, and that's part of the consideration in terms of what is the total cost of ownership, what are all of the unforeseens that we need to be mindful of, especially if they're new to the category. The second impact around this economic pressure is around, potential optimism in the face of that pressure. And so we're seeing, people prioritize rewarding experiences, potentially making those bigger, large asset purchases. And the success of the boating industry, we think, will partially depend on strategically repositioning and thinking about how do we frame this as an attainable luxury? How do we emphasize the experience element and think about that instant gratification of, relaxing when you're on the water or spending time with family. So it really is about that balance of what you're spending and what you're getting out of that experience. And then the third impact around the economy is really the changing definition of ownership. And we touched on this briefly in terms of mentioning clubs. But certainly we see this happening not just in the boating industry, but overall, that there's a big questioning about, is now the right time to own anything versus do I want to rent first? And this is happening in homes, in cars, any of these kind of big purchases. And so, as we're thinking about how do we get more people comfortable on the water, really kind of familiar with the category, they are more open to different kinds of shared service models, co-ownership, lots of different kind of new things coming on in terms of getting people more comfortable and making that time on the water more accessible without necessarily pulling the trigger immediately on the bigger financial cost of ownership and the commitment to owning. So when we think about, beyond those kind of financial pressures, I mentioned social reconfiguration, and this kind of stems from some of the things that Stephanie was starting to talk about as well, is that we do see overall that the U.S. is becoming certainly more diverse, that we're getting to that place where we're starting to become a majority minority dynamic in terms of the society. And so I think in that sense, that is certainly one element of the social reconfiguration. But if you think about gender, that plays a big role as well. And we see that women are making many more of the discretionary purchase spending decisions, but we're also seeing that they're potentially going to inherit more wealth. So we've talked, at least within Ipsos, we've talked about the wealth transfer and that may benefit women more than men. So that's another area for us to think about as, the gender of our owners in the future and who's interested might be starting to change as well. The other thing that we're seeing in terms of social reconfiguration is around milestones. And Stephanie kind of mentioned this in terms of traditional views of generation, for example, that Gen Z doesn't yet have the financial responsibilities and the life responsibilities of kids and houses and things like that. But we're also seeing that in the US is shifting later. So people are getting married later, buying houses later, making decisions later in terms of all of those kind of milestones. So generational, we're starting to see that shift much older. And what that may mean then is that we have more flexibility in terms of where people are in their lives and when they're ready to make a purchase like a boat. So really thinking about how does this potentially change and potentially open up more opportunities for us. The implications of this really mean, number one, we have to come to grips with growing diversity and this generational changeover, and that, with understanding generations, that there is more diversity, that as Stephanie mentioned, they're more digitally inclined, that it really is reshaping many industries. And so it's something that we're looking at in terms of really kind of addressing skill barriers, potentially focusing more urban, but also how to think about, reflecting who is our current customer, who is our potential customer, and how those might be different, and being really welcoming to all walks of life, all ages, all kind of mindsets, even if they aren't they don't look like your traditional boater. I think the second impact is equally important when we talk about those changing milestones and a shift in milestones. There is some pushback. Some people are choosing, not to attend college, to go the entrepreneur route, to not purchase a house because they're priced out of it. But that at the same time may free up some more discretionary income. So if you think about the flexibility of, spending on experiences, it may be that that capital is freed up to more outright boat purchases. So there's a lot more kind of questioning of what success looks like in the US, which may be transforming not just the boating market, but of course, transforming how people define life stages and how people are thinking about what success looks like. It may not be those traditional markers of ownership. And so that kind of flexibility of thinking about milestones differently and not necessarily judging a book by its cover when we're looking at, people who walk into the door. And the last one is around mindful living and spending. And we kind of hinted at this a little bit, but there's definitely that kind of blue therapy element that you'll hear us mention in the full playbook. And that really has a lot to do with the restorative nature of being on the water and how much consumers are still prioritizing lifestyles, even despite the economic circumstances that many find themselves in. They're still prioritizing experiences that help with their well-being, that help them feel restored. So if you think about potentially dialing up mental clarity, that sense of restoration, that sense of calm on the water and fun, certainly an area of opportunity that we see coming to the forefront. The last macro force was around tech acceleration, and this is really kind of a duality that on the one hand, technology is really infused with our lives, and this is changing, day by day in terms of people adopting more artificial intelligence for everything from shopping to researching. But at the same time, there's a lot of kind of worry about what is the impact of technology? Is it good for us? Is it going to have a negative impact on society or on the economy? Jury's still out, but I think that kind of duality is something that we can also play into. So, on the one hand, to Stephanie's point earlier about we need to really embrace the fact that shopping journeys have changed, research journeys have changed, that a lot of the younger generations that are over-indexing in our prospective buyer groups are certainly expecting to make that research and purchase journey much more online than previous generations have. And so embracing social media, embracing more information on your sites, all of that kind of comes into play here. But I think the other kind of piece that's really evolving very quickly is people are not just shopping on mobile phones. And, we have to think about the way that our content shows up on mobile devices and smaller screens, but they're also adopting AI. So they're starting to think about how to really use AI as part of that research and shopping journey. And this is changing every day. But I think that kind of not just using social media, but using other types of technology such as AI to help you learn about the category is certainly something that we're seeing move forward. And so that really comes into play in terms of, what the need is for the industry in terms of finding that right balance between where technology is great and we can lean into it. We can use things like digital journey exploration and really making that seamless from every touch point from very early in the process of learning about the industry to looking at different boat models and finding dealers to what does that service handoff look like, really kind of making that much more seamless and integrated across the full ownership model. But then also thinking about, if people are much more open to new technology, they're also potentially open to a boating experience that integrates technology. So not just having a satellite speaker system, but thinking about all of the different things that we can dial up from things like assisted docking to more intuitive navigation interfaces. How do you dial up that element of technology that makes boating safer or more fun or easier, more accessible? And then the last one, Stephanie hit on this already, but I think just bears underscoring that social media is a really big source of influence, especially for these prospective buyers and especially for the younger groups within those. So it really has evolved from, a channel where consumers are kind of going every once in a while to they're going there for research, they're going there for advice. And that really kind of ties into this idea of how do we create more authentic storytelling? How do we develop more trust with our prospective owners? In part by partnering with people who are trusted amongst their social media network. So thinking about how do we connect the industry with the consumer base through people that they see online, through people that they trust. So there is a lot more information that is available to you in terms of detailed profiles of each of the prospective and current owners that look at this future-proofing view, and look at what are the macro forces. How do we think about the impact, and how is that going to really influence the behaviors, the needs, the motivations, and some very tactical recommendations in terms of how to connect, what kind of messaging to dial up, what kind of channels to think about, what are some of the opportunities there now and next. So all of that is contained within the handbooks. And then wanted to leave you with a few thought starters before we get into questions, really just to share, a little bit of the kind of key insights and some of the takeaways to take back to your teams. Number one, I think, we talked a little bit about exposure to water, and that experience with boating is certainly important. And that does correlate with boat ownership. But we also have seen within the study that boating adjacent activities like swimming, fishing, that those correlate with boat ownership as well. So we can look to that kind of adjacent territories, activities for different kinds of partnership opportunities, visibility, sponsorship. All of those kind of things give us a lot more opportunity to expand our visibility with potential owners. The second big thing that came out of the study is that, we talked about this a little bit, but we have to embrace that today's prospective owners, they're navigating some very real financial concerns. They are embracing and exploring non-ownership access, things like clubs, things like shared ownership or rentals, as Stephanie mentioned. But they're really also navigating that at the same time that they're navigating a different purchase journey that is being shaped by different kinds of decision-making touch points. It's being shaped certainly more by social media and by other people. And that all plays into, where are people looking for information and looking for a trusted source of recommendations. The third takeaway, regardless of where you are in the purchase journey, and where you are in the industry, is that current owners do, to Stephanie's point right at the beginning, and I think this bears kind of repeating because it's so important in terms of the differences between current owners and prospective owners, is that current owners do skew older, wealthier, more educated. They also have an optimistic view of their personal finances, as we mentioned, perhaps because they're older and wealthier. So they're really kind of more of the traditional buyer in terms of relying on manufacturer and dealer information, a little bit of, looking at online reviews, but they really have that trust in the manufacturer and dealer websites. Now, that is in contrast to the prospective owners who, as we mentioned at the beginning, but really important, skew younger, more price constrained, engaging a little bit more with charters and rentals, and really relying more on friends and family, on social media, on YouTube, on influencers for guidance. So it really is this kind of bifurcation of the market in terms of current owners and prospective owners that we wanted to make sure and share and kind of land that point. So we'll go through the last couple of slides at a high level, and I think this will give you a sense of, where there are different opportunities depending on where you sit within the industry. But there's a lot more detail, of course, in the handbooks that are available. And as Stephanie mentioned in the beginning, each of the prospective owner groups are targeted toward different elements of, where they sit within the purchase journey and the purchase funnel. And how to really think about ways to connect with them differently. So you'll see some overlap across manufacturers versus dealers. But we think about, in a lot of cases, how do you kind of think about the opportunity to help people deal with that kind of pressure in terms of finance, and thinking about, it doesn't have to be the most expensive vessel. It doesn't have to be all of the bells and whistles to get into the category. But how do you help kind of make people more comfortable as and serve that role of a trusted mentor, but also think about how boating can really be enjoyed for different reasons, more sustainability, better mental health, really kind of homing in on that idea of enjoyable family experiences, spending time with your kids, really kind of thinking about dialing up that messaging in terms of reflecting that, of course. And then thinking about, leaning into technology in a few different ways, from new boat features to more standardized digital assets, more kind of immersive digital experiences. And then thinking, of course, about partnering with different platforms, influencers, to really think about how to reach people across those digital channels. So it is for manufacturers and OEMs, both about that digital experience and the journey, but also leveraging other channels that we don't necessarily own. And I think similar story here for dealers. So thinking about what that crossover and what that overlap looks like. We talked a little bit this at the outset, but improving that transparency and trying to help people who are new to the category really understand what maintenance is going to look like, what their options are in terms of, predictable costs, or at least being aware of what routine maintenance is going to look like. But also thinking about, how do we engage people in the community? Are there local organizations, different places that we can partner with to really kind of bring more visibility, to get more people engaged? And then thinking about, too, as part of that collaboration locally, how do we think about fun, low commitment on water events? How do you get people a little bit more comfortable, give them that firsthand taste? And along the same lines, taking kind of a cue from clubs, how do we offer more introductory boating, safety courses, walkthroughs with captains, to really get people a little bit more familiar and more interested in getting into boating, especially if they haven't had that first time experience and haven't grown up with it. And then lastly, on that note about digital experiences and technology, making sure that for dealers and for that purchase journey, that end of the funnel, that people are really comfortable in that digital experience and that it's connected to that in-person journey. So when they walk into the dealership, that they do feel like it's a seamless experience. And also really thinking about sweating our assets in terms of what we do have, from mobile-friendly websites to tools that help you compare models. How do you really kind of lean into that journey and how that's changing over time for prospective owners? So we've thrown a lot at you, but what's available is the playbooks or handbooks, if you will, that really go into much, much more depth about today's boating landscape, who the current and potential boaters are, really deep profiles that we talked through at a high level today, and then a much deeper dive on future proofing analysis and really practical and tactical recommendations for everyone within the industry to be able to more effectively communicate and support boaters and bring more people into the industry over the next several years. So we certainly have a lot more to share with you in terms of what's available to download, but we'd love to pause and see if there are any additional questions. And we've got a little more than 50, almost 20 minutes now, I think.
Thank you, Jennifer and Stephanie. Um, Folks, as Jennifer just said, we've got a little bit of time here, so we love to hear some questions. If you needed them to lean into a particular area where there's some clarity needed, which barriers are most addressable by manufacturers versus dealers versus Discover Boating? Did you guys hear me?
Oh,
Yeah.
that was the question. Sure. Um, I don't, can you repeat it? Is it areas or was it prospects?
Hold on a second. Let me go back to it. Which barriers are most addressable?
Oh, barriers.
Yeah.
I think when we think about it, reflect respective to the prospects. I mean, I think Discover Boating is really, and Kevin, obviously correct me if I'm wrong, working to drive awareness, share information, get people inspired, get people interested. So when for people who maybe aren't ready for that purchase, or even the groups of people who aren't 100% confident with how to use, how to maneuver, where to use, what types of boats exist, that I see is really a sweet spot for Discover Boating. For manufacturers and dealers, I think a critical piece is going to be building trust through transparency. Um, there's only so much I think you can do in terms of a price point and what people can financially really, manage. But what's really critical, I think, is highlighting end-to-end investment, even the different steps within a purchase journey. I think when I like to think about it referring like back to a car. Like you get your warranty, you get your insurance, you can buy additional warranties. These are the things you should have for insurance. These are how like here's the gas prices. Like all of those things are elements that boat owners and prospective owners really want to know. And then I think a lot related to family friendliness, tech, AI, how can technology help or make it easier or make you feel more comfortable? I would say those are all areas for dealers and manufacturers, but welcome Jen and Kevin's input.
Yeah. The one thing that I'll add to that, and this came up in conversation earlier this week as we were talking about this, and I think that there's an element of, a little bit of fear, to be quite honest. And this is true not just for this industry, but I think in many industries, people are afraid of, I don't want to look dumb. I don't want to look like I don't know what I'm doing. And I think there's a lot of apprehension, but it's actually something that we see in many categories. If you think about younger generations, preferring to interact with a kiosk rather than talk to a sales associate if they're picking up their lunch. It really is a generational difference in terms of willingness to, pick up a phone and call and ask a question or talk to a real person. So I think from that perspective, both manufacturers and dealers have a bit of a challenge ahead. And how do you get people that information, help them feel a little bit more comfortable, help them make the next step, but also do so in a way that doesn't feel threatening and helps them educate themselves, feel a little bit more comfortable, feel good enough to be able to have a conversation with you so that you can make that sale. I think that is a big challenge societally and something that all of our clients are dealing with. But I think lots of opportunities as we've been talking about digital and social and calculators and more information and walkthroughs. The more information that you can arm them with and the more that you can provide that kind of context and education, the better they'll feel about having that next conversation with you.
Thanks, guys. There's another question. Can we get a copy of this to show our dealers? As we mentioned earlier, there is a dedicated handbook for dealers, and tomorrow there's actually a MRA a webinar where Stephanie and Jennifer will join us again to walk dealers through this. So, and if you scan on this QR code here, you'll be directed to the site, the Discover Boating B2B site, where you can see it down. There are links to all of the handbooks. Next question. Let's see here. Maggie, you working with me here, my friend? Um, where are we losing consumers between inspiration and engagement? How can manufacturers close the gap?
Stephanie, do you want to take that one and then I can layer on?
Yeah, sorry, I was thinking about it. Um, I think we don't have this specifically, right? We didn't ask consumers kind of where are you, plot yourself on this. But I think when you think about the decisions that have to be made at engagement, it I think it comes down to contemplating how will this fit in my life? Am I going to use it? Is it suitable for my household and my family? Where can I go that's near me? How long is it going to take? And then is it all really worth it when I think about the investment? And so to me, that speaks really to particularly the one group of the time pressed group, but really, it is really not a transactional purchase, right? It is a huge life investment that if you do it right, can really impact a lot of areas, right? How you spend your weekends, how you spend your evenings. Are you using it? I know a lot of people that live on Cape Cod and they use it to get to restaurants, right? So, how can you actually incorporate the use of it and drive the value of it to your overall lifestyle? I know Jen also talked a lot about blue therapy, not just how you're spending time, but what are the mental benefits? So it really, I think, comes to making sure people know all of the value that they will get out of this, aside from taking it out a couple times this summer, where it can be more integrated.
I think another when we've seen this in our work over the last few years, you can inspire someone, but the engagement requires nurturing that person because a lot of these consumers don't know what they don't know. So they're inspired to go boating, but then, okay, what's next? And what are those steps? Whether it's rentals, charters, boat shows, dealers, there's a lot there to unpack for folks. And so that nurturing is critical to bring that person along such that they are comfortable and we don't lose them um, when they are inspired to this engagement environment, because there is a lot between the two that has to happen.
I think social media is also a really good avenue for highlighting all of that, right? Because it doesn't have to come from a professional. It can come from someone like me who has a boat and who uses it, and you can kind of see how they integrate it, right? Obviously, where you live is going to have an impact on that, but I think about like the fishing industry, and they've done it really well of like highlighting someone like me who integrates this into a lot of aspects of my life, and I think it can be done for boating as well.
Okay, we have another question here. What variables would you say have the most predictive power on whether someone would be a prospective buyer or not? And on the macro level, are there any variables you saw that have direct predictive power on market performance?
So we didn't address the second part of that question, but in terms of elements that have the most impact of someone owning a boat, we do know that the water gene, the desire to be on the water, is critical, and that's where driving exposure for consumers is going to be most impactful. We know that I think Jen mentioned boating adjacent activities. These are specifically things like paddle boarding, fishing, canoeing, or kayaking. Those engagement with those sort of drives this desire to potentially own a larger vessel. And then at a lower experience, we have other outdoor activities. So people who like to be outdoors, those are people most likely who are going to be and wanting to purchase a boat. And we do know that there are childhood experiences, right? You can't necessarily impact someone's childhood if they're an adult today, but this is where I think highlighting how it can be so appropriate for families. By doing that, you are also, impacting the future buyers. So having frequent exposures, having really good fond memories of those experiences on the water as a kid really impact someone's likelihood to buy. So that's I think it's getting people access.
Yeah, and I think even though we don't have a measurement for the predictive power of the bigger variables, I would feel very confident saying that economic uncertainty is going to be a big one in terms of market performance. If you look at what's been happening with the escalating conflict in the Middle East, the impact on gas prices, it's having a very real effect on what people are able to purchase and how they're traveling, what kind of vacations they're taking. So I would think, we would be remiss not to acknowledge that that is having a real impact, not just the conflict, but also, the overall cost of living increases and the dichotomy, I would say, in terms of people who are more affected by that tend to be in the lower income levels versus people who are less affected. So we see that idea of the K-shaped economy playing out in terms of how comfortable people are feeling. Those who are a bit more insulated, certainly less worried about that. But I think overall, the sense of uncertainty is something that we've seen overall kind of hang on since the pandemic, not just economic, but in terms of kind of realizing that life is unpredictable. But I think that you also can lean into that to say, like, why not pull the trigger today? Who knows what's going to happen tomorrow?
This is a little shift. Where do we see the role of boat shows as far as outreach to the groups?
We talked a lot about boat shows early on. And I think we talked about the potential of having boat shows evolve to some degree, not just being a place to make a deal, but an opportunity to drive enthusiasm for the industry, exposure. If there are opportunities for on the water experiences, I think different prospective groups are looking for different levels of information, but family friendly atmospheres, places you can go with your family, not necessarily just a place to see a wide range or, the newest things, but also to learn. Um, Jen, feel free.
Yeah, I would echo that too, that I think that kind of idea of more on the water experience, more family friendly experience, opportunities for people to get a little bit more comfortable to get that education because we might be looking at people who are a little bit further up in the funnel. They don't know yet exactly what they're looking for, or they might be looking for a little bit more education. And again, like thinking about how to lower that intimidation factor. So is it something that you can just join in? You don't have to go talk to a specific manufacturer if you're not ready to do that or if you're overwhelmed by that. So how do you build in some more of those touch points within that in-person experience to get people more comfortable, to help them learn a little bit more? It might look a little bit different as an ancillary event or as something that is before the kind of the real buyers who are ready to pull the trigger and want to talk models walk in the door. But I think thinking about that expansively. That being said, I think there's also an opportunity for smaller events as well. I remember one of the board members that we talked to was talking about they've had really good opportunities come from owners events. So having someone who has purchased from their dealership then host an event for their friends and neighbors and get them on the water and bring a couple of boats from the dealership that are similar to the model that that person owns and doing more of those small scale events. So nowhere near the huge scale of a boat show, but still like an opportunity that's lower pressure. It's people that you know, people in your neighborhood, to really introduce them and help them get a little bit more comfortable and more interested.
Okay, another question. Are boat clubs a long-term lead pipeline for OEMs, or are they cannibalizing future sales?
I don't know that we know the answer to this yet. I think what we know is we need to get people exposure. I also believe that it's not going to replace ownership if someone really wants to own. But I do think it is going to make the industry more accessible to people that were previously completely closed off from even considering what it might be like to own a boat.
I would agree with that. And I think that there's an opportunity for us to think about, what kind of flexibility clubs offer. So, for example, as you're moving through those life stages that Stephanie mentioned and where you are in that process, you may be at a point where, look, the kids are in tons of activities. We just don't use the boat enough. And maybe you switch back to a club at that point. But that doesn't mean that you can't come back to ownership once the kids are out of high school and off to college and you have more time. So I think that's also something for us to think about. It doesn't have to be one or the other or a specific order that people can move in and out of different elements of the category as well.
Yeah, and something else that, I think it's not that boat clubs are necessarily new, but I think it's more of a novel idea of thinking about how are there ways to partner with boat clubs as different, dealer or manufacturers so that you can stay in touch with those people who, as Jen mentioned, may go in and out. I think there's opportunity for new models of engagement given all of the uncertainty financially and, the desire to sustain the industry.
All right, this last question, this might be more of an NMMA focused question, but are OEMs still utilizing hardcover brochures, or is there a shift to digital?
Yeah, we did not cover that, but as someone who still really likes to have some things on hard copy and is a millennial, I would say probably both.
Yeah, unfortunately for budgets, I think it's both that you still have to produce the printed version. And part of the reason I say that is because I think there is a bit of a shift back to things that are tactile, the same things that drive us to actually want to be involved in boating are also similar to like that tactile, like real life, holding something in your hands, the idea of having vinyl. All of that is certainly, this sense of wanting to get back to physical things and being, frankly, a little bit overwhelmed by digital information and the amount and barrage of information that's getting pinged to us from our phones all day long, at work all day long. So I think that there is that element of like, nope, I really don't want to be on a screen right now. I just want to like sit down with a brochure and be offline. I think there's an element of that that's kind of a relief to a lot of people who are in that state of digital overwhelm.
Yeah, and I think it helps stay top of mind. You can so easily end up with, 40 apps or emails open on your phone, and then you only see the most recent one. So, okay.
I think that's it for questions. Yeah, thank you everyone for joining us this morning. We really appreciate it. The QR code is there. If you want to get your hands on this presentation, which is the executive summary, if you want to get your hands on the OEM handbook that's Stephanie and Jennifer mentioned, it's got a lot more information in there, a lot of good information in there, and actionable information in there. And as I said, if you want to join us again tomorrow and hear these wonderful young ladies uh, do this again and really lean into kind of the dealer area of the industry, we'll be doing that tomorrow as well. Maggie, what time is the webinar tomorrow?
11 a.m. Eastern time.
11 a.m. Eastern Time. Thank you again, everyone who joined us. Scan the QR code, share it with your colleagues, and reach out to us if you've got any additional questions. If you have more questions that you didn't want to bring up during this call, feel free to email us and we'll get them over to Stephanie and Jennifer and get back to you. Thanks so much. Have a great rest of your week.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.